Previously on Resident Evil Revelations.
Total coverage should hopefully be equivalent to what we have in the second half. So that was a complete and utter lie. Hello and welcome back to Final Fantasy Flawless. This is part 2 and we'll be covering Act 2. So if you haven't seen part 1, you can find the link here now or in the description below. Build details are also covered in part 1, so if you're curious, that's all in there as well. I won't be attaching info cards to the individual sections this time for two reasons. One, I learned there's a cap of 5 per video, so whilst I can compile them adequately to fit into 5 segments. Reason number 2, the way info cards display has changed since I last saw them used, so instead of having just one pop up when I put it in the time code, it shows all 5 of them at the bottom when you click on one of them, which kind of defeats the purpose of segmenting them. The full compilation will still be linked in the description, however, and segments are still using the stage names rather than bosses to minimise, at a glance, getting spoiled. With all that said, we have a lot to get through, so without further delay, let's get started. The first segment after the time skip, I honestly didn't even realise was a stage with a Medal of Valor attached, and I only found out when I went to get the screenshot of all the levels for the first video's thumbnail. Given the whole thing is essentially 2 ad phases and a regular War Panther brought in as a boss makes it really laughable as a challenge. It does make for a decent warm-up for this video, however, by being short and very readable. It's probably about on par with Midnight Raven in terms of difficulty, all things considered. The attacks are usually just one-off claw strikes that are safely countered. The move that I endearingly call the butt sweep is a bit slower to keep you on your toes, and there is also a rather speedy long-distance lunge that, once again, in a similar vein to Midnight Raven, was the only attack to get me because it was faster than I expected. All this is wrapped up with only one named attack, Savage, which has 2 forward slashes with only homing on the first, followed by a delayed homing bite. As a named ability, this one shouldn't particularly catch you off guard, and the simple moveset is rather easily overcome. The first thing of note with this fight is the lava at the edge of the arena can and will hurt you when you come into contact with it. It's an easy thing to avoid, but there were a couple of runs before I'd noticed this that had me scratching my head about where the damage was coming from. Liquid Flame has a lot of 2-hit attack combos, and pretty much all of the attacks I was safely able to counter with both abilities, resulting in some pretty decent stagger damage quite quickly. Fiery Impact, one of the first named moves it uses, is a single hit instead, but provides a large enough window to use abilities in as well. The main move that I struggled to get down completely in the first phase is the charge attack, predominantly due to the slightly different timings based on distance. Remembering that the charge followed a backhand made it easier to prepare and react appropriately, and whilst rook counters were preferred for it, Raging Fists blocks successfully but whiffs the counter, the ease in which I could use both counters in a chain in this fight meant I wasn't always holding it up just for this situation. One other thing I noticed was that using Judgment Bolt at the start rather than saving it for the first stagger meant Liquid Flame wouldn't be at the health thresholds to trigger phase 2 afterwards, allowing me to get a little bit more damage in overall in this phase as I could successfully get to the 50% stagger stun, use all my skills, and take advantage of Judgment Bolt's time freeze to get the hits in whilst Swelter is warming up, triggering Phase 2. Phase 2 follows much of the same principles, though with a couple of extra moves to look out for, where Liquid Flame becomes a Wyvern or a Curl. The Curl is a circular AoE, and there's more than enough time to move out of the way entirely if you want to be careful, whilst the Wyvern chases you down with a Breath of Fire. These are usually followed up with a named attack like Faraga, pretty standard projectile, or Fiery Impact. Eructation, a named attack that does also appear in Stage 1, but is a simple matter of walking off, is a bit more dangerous in Phase 2, as there's extra circles of flame that surround the main one, meaning you have to course correct or dodge to avoid it if you end up walking into one of the other circles. I found dodging just as you got into the main circle usually lined up with about the eruption window, though using Shiva's extra distance would generally be the safer option. The transition to Phase 3 begins with 11th hour, and is the last major hurdle for the boss. The initial explosion does no damage, but it is a pushback effect, so standing as close to the centre is ideal to avoid touching the lava. And yes, I did lose one of my runs to that. This is followed up by a chain of dashing curls that you have to dodge out of the way of, ideally alternating dodge direction to stay close to the centre. The wyverns that follow each breathe fire towards the centre, and you have to dodge between two of them to safely avoid it. Shiva's extra distance did great work here. Finally, a large explosion from liquid flame as it spawns on top of you, which once again Shiva dodges just completely trivialise. There's a sizable opening following this, which gives you enough time to get off a few skills before it shows off the new moves added to this phase. Flagrant Wyvern, a ground slam attack, and Flagrant Curl, a single instance of 11th hour's curl charge. There's not really an opening to counter these, as the transition window between forms can't be damaged, but this is made up for by the fiery impact that the reformed liquid flame follows up with. And with that, all the moves are on the table for liquid flame to mix up as the AI chooses, and one more stagger is all I need to finish off the boss. This was a fun one. Hugo Kupka always begins with this massive arm charge, just asking to be countered, and there's even enough time to start with an LB Judgment Bolt to maximise damage. Hugo's general patterns are pretty simple, but there's a number of things to take into account. First off is his regular punch attack, which he does after floating like a butterfly for a bit. This is always followed up with a quick kick that would often punish regular dodge counters, and still on occasion caught me when Rook countered without dodging shortly after the animation ended. His Titan Fist attack meanwhile is an absolute joke in this stage, with how long it takes to wind up, only for a single punch with a large opening afterwards. However, Hugo does have his own parry ability, where after so many hits he'll deflect you back, most of the time following up with Sledgehammer. In every instance where I was pushed back and tried to Raging Fist counter it, it seemed to just go through the block, but dodging or using Rook's Gambit worked each time without issue. This counter is problematic when it comes to the midpoint staggers, as you have to be careful not to hit Hugo too much before a deadly takedown, or he'll parry his way out of the stagger window. It is, however, able to be used to our advantage at the end of the stagger phase, where the rapid strikes of Gouge can trigger it, giving us one more Sledgehammer to Rook counter before the phase transition. Phase 2 begins with Kupka burying underground and using Geocrush, and whilst there's time to dodge out of it normally, jumping the Tremor that stuns you just lets you walk out without issue. Getting back in for damage with Ignition was a challenge, as there was a sweet spot where I'd be able to hit Hugo right as he landed, but doing it later sometimes meant getting hit during recovery frames. Whilst doing it early was safer than late, it did lead to situations of me bullying the wall instead. Hugo's attacks from Phase 1 carry over, but with some variations. Titan's Fists now have 3 punches, though countering the first 2 means that the third just misses, and the regular punch into kick now has less hopping, giving less time to prepare and more time to mistakenly counter and get kicked in the noggin. Hugo now can also block on his own. I assume whatever hidden variable determines the deflection in Phase 1 also applies to this, as sometimes I've had ample opportunity to realise and stop attacking to guard break, whereas others, the second I've seen it, it's too late. Attacking into this guard will trigger a counter move that can't be avoided, and after one too many times of being flung into the air by an uppercut from trying to Flaming Blade the block, I opted to go for the safer charge spell method of breaking the guard. Hugo also now has 3 new named attacks to keep in mind. Weight of the Land summons exploding circles of earth, whilst Landslide is a blast in a straight line, both of which tend to be used one after another. Tumult, meanwhile, is a chain of 3 shockwaves, sending out a circular wave from the impact point. Whilst moving back and jumping over them is safer, I preferred sticking close to Hugo, where I was able to get a counter hit and a regular swing between each shockwave. Torment signifies the transition to Phase 3, and after many attempts dodging through it normally, I remembered I have Shiva for a reason, which trivialized the entire attack. The main issue I was running into is the attacks were all ever so slightly slower than I'd expect, with enough of a mix-up between the speeds to allow one hit to get me each time. After the onslaught of attacks, Hugo finishes with Earth and Fury, a large circular AoE from around him that has a massive explosion that lingers for a bit, but leaves a large opening for countering afterwards. Gap closing with Ignition, we officially transition into Phase 3. Hugo now has an Earth Blast that he always starts off with, being a single attack that happens after the hopping steps, similar to the regular punch into kick. Titan's Fists now also finish off with a slam that tracks, but provides a much larger opening for counter-attacking after. Earthen Fist and Strip Mine are two abilities that can happen instead of Sledgehammer after a counter parry, the former being much slower to come out, but Raging Fists is able to successfully block it, whilst the latter usually I'd just walk out of. Force of the Land can be jumped over, and I usually use the flashing visual cues to time it. Deadly Takedown can be used to get more height if you really want to play it safe, but isn't particularly necessary, and dodging also works. The final attack in this stage, and the one that gave me the most trouble, was Upheaval, which combined the shockwaves of Tumult earlier with the AoEs of Weight of the Land. My successful run accidentally ended up using Garuda to lift me above the shockwaves, and in retrospect jumping them would have likely been the ideal method, but in the heat of the moment it was rather hectic trying to keep track of both the spawning circles and constantly approaching shockwaves, and my previous habit of counter-attacking between tumults made me want to dodge in whenever I could. Theoretically, I reckon it's possible to phase skip Upheaval, with better DPS from using Lionheart and Strength tonics, as well as a better skill composition, as I was able to consistently stagger Hugo before it was used, but I fell short on the damage to finish him off before he recovered. Whether staggered before or after Upheaval, Kupka's fight is all but spent, and it's only a couple more moves before he's defeated quite handily. Fighting Titan is an absolute blast normally. It's a thrilling fight full of blood-pumping moments and sweet cutscene transitions as you duke it out. Flawlessing Titan is another matter entirely, mostly because of how much time each attempt takes, not only because of the cutscenes, but also since if you mess up during the running or asteroid segments, you can't restart until you're back with normal controls, or force a reset, which, honestly, is probably faster. Titan is truly an endurance match more than a challenge, as most of his attacks are a lot slower than they first seem, and Ifrit's wider dodges makes it easier to get out of the way, even if you're not getting precision dodges all the time. Phase 1 opens with Geocrash, which can be stopped with Spitflare, though I do delay it a bit and step forward to be close enough to Heat Rush afterwards, once the Spitflare finishes. Beyond this, his AI is a lot less hard programmed to follow a strict pattern from my experience, and you'll mostly just be dodging various slow punches and stomps. I'd say there's 3 attacks to keep an eye out for. A large kick, and whilst the kick itself is slow enough that a sloth could dodge it, he finishes it off by slamming his foot down quite quickly, and can sometimes catch perfect dodge counters before you can dodge again, depending on when exactly in the kick the dodge happened. A double foot stomp is the second attack to keep an eye out for, and whilst there's a lot more time between the two to dodge, it is a double attack compared to most of the other attacks which are only single swings. And the final attack to keep an eye out for is a double rock throw, which he'll only usually use if you've got a bit of distance between you, but with how slow Titan is, sometimes he'll start the attack as you're closing in, and it won't be a threat until you're already underneath him. Outside of this, the named attacks for this phase are Geocrash, as cancelled at the start, though is also a very good option for Brimstone countering with how slow it is, and Voice of the Land, which is effectively Hugo's Weight of the Land, but blue, with a bit of a stun at the start. One crystal will always spawn below you after a slight delay, but you'll have time to walk it off, which was my preferable method for dodging this attack, as depending on where the crystals spawn, you could accidentally dodge into one and get hit. A useful trick I found for better clarity was tilting the right stick to look down as you're stunned, making it just that little bit easier to safely walk and keep on attacking. The Stone's Throw stage transition is nothing special. You can destroy the rocks, and walking side to side, shooting fireballs will get the job done. Trying to maximise damage, however, I prefer to perfect dodge through the rocks and counter, as charged fireballs could hit Titan, but required you to be at a certain distance before they actually hit, as well as often getting blocked by the rocks. The rest of this part of the fight is pretty much the same loop, with a couple of extra moves. The charge attack is the most distinct one, and is most commonly the opener move once Titan re-enters the arena, and also tends to be followed up by Earthshaker or Strip Mine as the new named attacks, both of which traverse over a line or wedge respectively, but I'd usually get close enough to just dodge the initial wave and carry on comboing. Do or Die's running phase, there's a few ways you can approach it, though I found the safest way is to just spam fireballs whilst running, watching the ground in front of you for rocks, and dodging anytime a destructible one gets too close, which rarely happens to be fair. It takes 3 shots to break a rock, or 1 charged shot, which can be used to snipe rocks ahead of time if positioned correctly, but I rarely did this outside of the first and last rocks, as all too often their tracking would home in on the wrong target, where the smaller fireballs would just work better, even if it does look a bit messier. Once on the tendrils, you also get the crystals shooting up from the ground, which can be walked around, but there's no harm dodging it too, just to be safe, whilst constantly firing projectiles to deal with the falling rocks, before we transition over to Titan Lost. This phase follows a rigid sequence, which makes it easy to repeat as there's little variation. I did learn, however, that whilst the stage transitions are based off certain health thresholds, it would only do it if you reached that threshold during a stagger phase, so sometimes whilst I was able to use charged fireballs to make a faster stagger, if I whiffed Brimstone or had too many attacks get eaten by a wonky bit of tracking, it would lead to repeating the whole segment. This only happened to me twice, once in Stage 2 and once in Stage 3, so is usually a non-issue, but I feel it's worth mentioning. Stage 1 opens with a Finger Slam, my preferred attack to Brimstone counter, as positioning yourself under it gets the damage off from the initial hit, and keeps you invulnerable until after the crystal shockwaves have passed, giving you just about enough time to get a full Blackdraft combo into Spitflare. Spitflare can be used first to have it off cooldown earlier, but guarantees you won't get the full Backdraft combo off before the hand retracts. This is followed by a Punch. Keep your eyes on the impact lines on the ground, as it will still damage you until they disappear if you try to melee it, but once they're gone, you can Heat Rush in and Backdraft combo. We then have the Hand Swipe, which you just want to dodge through, ideally perfectly, and Fireball counter. Finally, we have 2 Fist Slams, first on the left and then the right. These send shockwaves out on impact, which you can dodge through, and usually with enough charged fireballs you can stagger during the first slam so you don't have to worry about the second, though in the event you don't, you should also have Brimstone backup, which you can use on the second impact. Stage 2 starts with Stone's Throw, which is presumably intended to be Brimstone through, but a dodge suffices, followed swiftly by a punch. I tend to use Spitflare on it if it's off cooldown as it comes in, as it should have refreshed by about the end of the phase. Once the punch is retracted, we have a backhand swipe this time, coming from the opposite side, leading into the Finger Slam, which again we ignore with Brimstone. Granite Rain is another new move for the stage, and starts with a single falling rock to dodge out of the way of before it starts raining small rocks from above. I take this time to get as many charged fireballs in as possible, positioning myself at the back of the arena so the pushback doesn't accidentally knock me into a rock, and keep my eyes on the ground so that I can move out the way of the growing shadows as the rocks fall. Finally, if Titan's not staggered yet, we have the double fist slams with shockwaves, and then we move on to stage 3. This stage starts with a Tendril Slam, which also fires a shockwave like the fist slams to dodge, followed by Stone's Throw that we dodge through again, followed by a punch that gives us our first major opening for damage. Finger Slam comes next, and you know the drill by now, and this is followed up by a forehand and backhand swipe back to back, not giving any melee openings but both still vulnerable to a fireball counter. Double fist slams finish the stage again, or at least where I usually have staggered by, but watch out for that sneaky falling rock before the first fist impact. There's enough of a window to dodge it and then the shockwave, but it can blindside you if you're too focused on the fist. This leads to another transition phase, which I dubbed the asteroid phase, as the main thing you're doing is shooting rocks out of the air. Rocks still take 3 shots or 1 charged shot to break, but unlike before you have a reticle to aim and confirmation when the lock-on is active, so I preferred to use charged fireballs for this part. When the tendril appears, there's still a couple of rocks to destroy, where you can get a shot in at the tendril in between them, as opposed to waiting the whole time. Just don't forget about the incoming rocks. I quite literally lost more runs to this final fucking stone than I did all of Titan Lost, and it's such a dumb way to lose a run too. And yet, the fight still goes on. As in this phase you're perpetually falling, keep in mind that you're considered airborne and so all your combos are 3 hits instead of 4. There aren't any multi-string attacks during this phase, but unlike the first phase, your dodge timing has to be more on point, as the slow attack timings will actually hit you during the recovery frames. The most common offender for this was one where Titan does a full flip before the attack smashes down on you, as I always expected it to be some sort of kick, which it inevitably isn't. Noticeably, my flawless run never had Titan use that move, so hooray for AIE RNG, I guess. Outside of the standard attack affair, Titan has a number of moves he uses whilst he's on the walls. At the start he'll only go on them to throw rocks at you, but at around the 50% health mark he'll widen the cavern and start running down it before corkscrewing at you, or use Earthshaker to produce massive crystals to strike you from the side. You do actually have some control over where you're positioned to the left or right of the screen, so doing this in response to Earthshaker is a valid way to get out of range entirely, though playing it safe and dodging as it comes was beneficial for better counters, and also because you don't want to chance losing a run at the 20-minute mark. For a similar reason, I've not attempted to dodge through Stone's Throw like during the Titan Lost phase, and just used Brimstone as intended. After surviving such a lengthy onslaught, and on 2 occasions quite literally throwing the fight just 1 hit away from triggering a cutscene, there's a brief battle of blows before felling Titan and moving on to the next battle. Fun fact, this is the boss I got to before I stopped to make the first video, and whilst storage space was the main factor, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't procrastinating slightly. During my test run I was panicking over the Phoenix stage, especially with a Mega Flare and just how difficult it would be to flawless, knowing that after all this, there was still another phase to fight in space. Oh, thank the founder. I'd completely forgotten that, like Garuda, the stages are separated, and so all this was technically not necessary for the Medal of Valor. But I'm sure, as you know by this stage, I'm in it for the thrill. So I took a stab at it anyway, and eventually I somehow managed to pull it off. A flawless Phoenix stage. And a flawless Ifrit stage. It was glorious! The adrenaline, the elation, absolute euphoria! Then I came to edit this video and realised I'd taken a hit in the intro stage of that run. The easiest portion. The shortest bit. Damn it all. Still, it's a phase I've flawless multiple times before, both during the main attempts and the Phoenix phase attempts, and given it's a bonus fight rather than the Medal of Valor one, for the time being I'm counting it as done, and once I'm finished with the rest of the bosses, I'm likely going to go back and have a shot at the fully flawless Ifrit Phoenix Bahamut fight. The very first segment is a short one that, having Spitflare already, basically lets us skip. Stepping forward slightly and using Brimstone gets the damage off, with enough time to do a full backdraft combo into Spitflare, triggering the cutscene where you unlock Spitflare. With Spitflare unlocked, Quintessence is used as the tutorial move, where you're expected to shoot down all the orbs, and whilst this is definitely the safer method, the orbs are also able to be destroyed with Wildfire Dash, letting us use the full grunt on Bahamut. I tended to prioritise going to the left with the dash, as when Bahamut uses the ranged wing slashes, Moving right puts you directly in line of fire, whereas left gives you more time to react both to it and any leftover orbs still chasing you. Bahamut's two main moves tend to be two aerial slashes, one from each wing, and flare breath, horizontally and vertically, though these attacks are usually finished up with either a corkscrew charge across the arena or a slam attack with another shockwave. Flare breath has the most mix-ups, as Bahamut can do a single blast or two, and can alternate between horizontal and vertical, which can catch you off guard if you're directly underneath them after dodging forward from a horizontal one. Aura Burst also comes out every now and then, being the attack most intended to be Brimstone countered. I found jumping first is the best way to use it, as the shockwaves sometimes go under Bahamut, and it also allows for a full aerial backdraft combo before landing afterwards. Generally, you only have to dodge one or two attacks in this stage, so after staggering Bahamut, you move on to the Phoenix stage. The sequencing of moves in the Phoenix stage are all the same, so I'll go over the moves first, and then the sequence for each stage. Damage is also capped between each segment, so whilst trying to get as much DPS as possible is appealing, there's a hard limit to how much you can do. The main trick to flawlessing this stage is using the full extent of the screen. Phoenix follows the targeting reticule, and this gives you a lot more vertical movement than it may first seem. Using this is ideal for dodging the opening laser that follows you around, and the nightmare that is Mega Flare. The technique I found best was starting in the top right and moving in a circle, watching the reticule so that if it collided with an edge, you begin moving it away immediately, using the extra movement from dodging to stay ahead of the projectiles. Whilst usually doing the trick, there were instances where one or two projectiles would clip a wing, and whilst the damage is minimal, it's a flawless run attempt, so the run's failed. The wing slashes are still present, and I preferred using a lock-on attack for these, both to give more focus to dodging the projectiles, either by moving out of their way or dodging around them at about the time they turn yellow, as well as normally getting locks quite quickly as Bahamut spins whilst using this move. Quintessence's orbs return, and whilst the tutorial for Phoenix's ability suggests the lock-on, I tended to prefer to use the Fire Blast most of the time, reserving the lock-on for any I'd missed after the first blast. Individual orbs can be dodged by moving out of the way entirely, but have large explosions, so are best destroyed when possible. Stages 2 and 3 have satellites which spawn, 2 in Stage 2, 3 in Stage 3, and shoot lasers outwards in a line, with a small amount of motion towards you whilst firing. Whilst not a threat alone, they can force you out of a safe position if left unchecked. A fire burst is enough to kill one, though they do move a short while after spawning, sometimes making it out with a sliver of health. Aside from the tracking laser, Bahamut uses his flare breath twice back-to-back per stage in set locations without much of a visual indicator before firing, and so was a matter of remembering when and where they fire, and not being there when they did. Finally, each phase ends with a corkscrew attack that still does damage should it hit you, so ensure to dodge out of the way of it whenever he does it. Stage 1's attack sequence is Tracking Laser, Wing Slashes times 2, Flare Breath, bottom left to top right, then top right to top left, Orbs, Mega Flare, and Corkscrew Transition. Stage 2's is Wing Slash times 3, Satellites, Flare Breath, top, then top to bottom middle, Mega Flare, Orbs, Wing Slash times 4, and Corkscrew Transition. Stage 3 goes Mega Flare, Orbs, Satellites, Wing Slash times 2, Flare Breath, bottom right to left, then bottom left to top right, Tracking Laser, Mega Flare, and Corkscrew Transition. Stage 4 is unique, spawning 6 tougher satellites that have to be destroyed before the countdown ends. You get about 3 fire blasts off before a large ring of orbs that take 2 fire blasts to deal with completely spawn. Then, once the countdown reaches 3, you'll get a pseudo Mega Flare style attack that is dodged in a similar manner to it. Once all the satellites are destroyed, you have enough time for 3 fire bursts before we transition back to Ifrit. I found the best method was not to destroy any of the satellites with your first bursts, and instead catching them as collateral when fire bursting the orbs. If enough damage was dealt to the satellites during this, you'll be able to destroy them all before the count reaches 3, and skip the mini flare. Ifrit Part 2 begins with Mega Flare, and dodging one projectile and using a counter gives the frames to avoid the rest of that volley, making it a much less frightful move than in the Phoenix stage. The slams and corkscrew charges are still present, though mix things up by sometimes doing 2 slams back to back, and the corkscrew now shoots off pillars of light that you have to avoid whilst closing the distance between you and Bahamut. Wing Slash now has a 3rd projectile to keep you on your toes, and one new named attack which is added to the mix, Mortal Coil, which shoots out a projectile that explodes into a large pillar of light. It's quite easy to avoid, but dodging forward and fireball countering can push you back into it if you're not careful. I tended to hold back on using Spit Flare during this stage, at least until the end of the stagger phase, as Bahamut has a semi-phase transition in the form of Terra Flare that provides a cutscene that gives enough time for skills to come off of cooldown. So we get more damage overall by saving it and not triggering this section too early. Terra Flare warms up with a small phase with numerous beams of light flooding the arena, similar to how Mirage Dive works. This ended a few runs, as dodging isn't the safest, as the distance you dodge as a Ifrit can easily put you into the line of fire of another beam. As such, it's a matter of more of walking as much as possible, avoiding the light as best as you can and dodging only in emergencies. Following the Terra Flare, Quintessence is the follow-up attack, but there is a small window where you can interrupt it before it spawns any orbs. Most of the time it was too early or too late and it would come out anyway, so Wildfire was still the usual go-to to deal with it, but when you pull it off, it helps an awful lot. Beyond that, the moveset is unchanged outside of Mortal Coil becoming Triple Coil, and as the name suggests, it fires 3 projectiles instead of 1. With that absolute beast of a section cleared, we're on to the actual Bahamut fight, as far as the Medal of Valor is concerned. Similarly to Titan Lost, I try to get in as many charged fireballs in between attacks as possible to eat away at that stagger bar, which in the first section, where the moves follow a sequence, worked out quite well as 3 charged fireballs followed by 3 fireball counters into Lightspeed Strike Burst finish, Lightspeed dashing to get close and spit flaring to stun Bahamut out of Supernova, tended to get him close enough to the 50% stagger to cancel out the Aura Burst. Failing that, you can still Brimstone it and get a few more hits before he flies back again, usually following up with one more attack before flying much further away and doing another Wing Slash attack into Supernova. The Supernova projectile can be destroyed by shooting it with charge shots, so it can be dealt with quite easily. There is still some room for variation in Bahamut's attacks compared to Titan Lost, however, and your distance from Bahamut will have an impact on that. Long distance is likely going to result in Mega Flare, but one perfect dodge and a counter attack is once again all that's needed to get through a flurry. Flare Breath now also has 2 variants, one that's blue, that fires 3 beams, whilst the golden variant is only 2. The same gold glow is present however when Bahamut charges forward, so you can't get too complacent with, oh it's gold, there's going to be 2 beams, or you'll end up getting hit by the charge every now and then. Following a cutscene, we now have satellites that will spawn. Most of the time you can lightspeed out of them straight to Bahamut, but I tended to prefer to move to the side, both to avoid dashing into a potential charge attack, and because at this point the AI is a bit more freeform, and doing this seemed to have the best chance of getting it to follow a similar pattern. An attack that got me a few times is Bahamut will now on occasion fly to the left or right, launching mini flares near the end of this movement. Moving in the same direction as Bahamut tend to just dodge them naturally without even having to dodge, but prematurely trying to close the distance in the attack would consistently get me hit and just put an end to the run. Radiance also comes into play at this stage, shooting out a large number of rotating beams that whilst were great fun to dodge in and out of, and provides lots of fireball counter opportunities, it also is a move that has a lot of room for error, so it's the one I opted to ignore by using Spit Flare most tries. Aura Burst is back with a vengeance, now shooting off beams outward from the explosion should you opt to move out instead of using Brimstone, but if you're still using Brimstone then it's very much the same song and dance. This move here, which I'll refer to as Laser Lanes, got me a couple of times, as ideally you're close enough to Wild Dash and get behind Bahamut for free damage, but in turn I'd either clip a laser from Wildfire and take some damage, or just have it run out just before a laser fires, dodge prematurely, and end up in another laser. In instances where I was a fair distance out and couldn't get behind Bahamut with a single dash, I ended up not risking it and just taking the time to walk normally out of the way instead. Giga Flare and Celestial Foundry are two moves that can come up which have suction to them. In Giga Flare's case, I found the best solution is to just wildfire away until it wore off and then lightspeed back to Bahamut, but Celestial Foundry has more of a wind-up, so you can lightspeed to them and then get behind before the Foundry goes off. Though I did opt to avoid melee during this after one instance where my attacks got me too close to the beams and they sucked me in, putting that run to an unfortunate and untimely end. As you near the end of the fight, Bahamut prepares Terra Flare, requiring you to press the attack. This phase itself is pretty straightforward, as the only attack to dodge during this are downward beams that first appear as black bars. Depending on how often they spawn on top of you, the timing can be tight on taking Bahamut down before Terra Flare goes off if you don't use Spit Flare, but it is possible, and given the ease of the phase I prefer to save it for skipping more dangerous moves. After that, it's just a matter of the final push to finish off what little health remains, and bring Act 2 to a close. To say my plan to do the rest in a single part was ambitious would be a little bit of an understatement. However, at least there's a neat dividing point here at the end of an act. Unlike last time, I do have all of the bosses for the next part done, so I can guarantee it won't be too long before that part is released. Most likely I'll be dropping it in about a week, so I'm not rushing to edit it all together. In the interim, I bid you all to take care, and I'll see you next time.